Bretton Woods with the backdrop of the Cold War created the conditions necessary for free trade in the next round of globalization. But the reality on the ground was nothing like what we know today. Transport costs may have come down dramatically, but jagged, wild frictions existed across the entire system. It took effort to pack goods into a truck, out of said truck into a warehouse, out of said warehouse onto a dock, packaged on said dock by a group of teamsters onto a pallet, said pallet shifted by another group of teamsters via a series of pulleys into a ship's hold, where another group of teamsters would secure said pallet for sailing. Said ship would then sail the ocean blue. Upon arrival at the receiving port, another group of teamsters would unload the previously mentioned pallet for inspection. Another group of teamsters would then load said pallet onto another truck, which would take it to a rail yard where another set of teamsters would load it onto a rail car, and said rail car would then ship it to an unloading facility where said pallet would be unloaded onto another truck. Only then would that truck be driven to the place that actually bought the thing. One piece at a time. By far the worst part, from a logistical and cost point of view, was the ports themselves. Each item needed to be separated from thousands of other items, unloaded onto a dock, physically inspected, often reloaded back onto the vessel because it was in the way, then re-unloaded and relocated to a local warehouse before it could start making its way to the consumer. More and bigger ships required more and bigger warehouses, farther and farther from the port, initiating an ever longer, ever more congested slug trail of ever more relentless cargo reshuffling, with bottlenecks stretching back onto the vessels themselves. The typical port experience consumed 5 days, and multiple swarms of longshoremen on each end, not including the large and swarthy ship crew of large and swarthy deckhands. All in all, it was a major pain in the ass that generated breathless opportunities for breathless levels of theft and corruption. No wonder that around the turn of the 20th century, ports often accounted for half of total shipping costs. Until, that is, we figured out how to put things in boxes. By the 1960s, the ever-rising volumes of trade demanded an end to this packaging and repackaging agony. The solution was to debut a couple of models of shipping boxes, specifically the 20-foot equivalent unit, or TEU, and the 40-foot equivalent unit, FEU. You probably know them by their colloquial name of containers, and have undoubtedly seen scads of them being carted around by trains, trucks, and semis. The containerization process transformed transport in general, and the world's ships and ports processes in specific. Now, a manufacturer fills a standardized container with their product and seals it. The container is mated to a truck which drives the goods to a port, where the container is demated and stacked with others of its kind. When a ship is ready, the container is craned directly onto the ship, in the proper order for weight balance, moved across the ocean by a small crew that's better with keyboards than free weights, and lowered onto a container stack port side. Since unpackaging and repackaging no longer occurs in the ports at all, ports no longer need warehouses, save for equipment and personnel purposes. All they now need is a flat parking lot to host endless container stacks. When the time comes, the container might be railed a bit before being craned directly onto a truck, and then it is simply driven off to its final destination for unpacking and processing. In theory, and largely in practice, the container is not opened once. Let's make this more personally accessible. If you've ever moved, you know that most people can fit everything they own into the back of an 18-wheeler. One of those 18-wheeler units, that's a FEU, is 40 feet long and about 8 feet wide and tall, equaling about 2,700 cubic feet on the inside. Imagine a move where you have to stuff your things in storage for a few days. Would you rather unpack and stack everything into a storage facility and then repack and restack everything into another container when you're ready, or just keep everything in the original FEU in a parking lot until you get your new keys? Now, Add in an ocean crossing and replay that sequence 200 million times per year, and you begin to see the scale of change for the global economy. It doesn't matter what's in the container, kiyas or kumquats, bauxite or bar tools. So long as the container's total weight remains under upper limits, all containers can be handled identically. What did it take for this standardization to occur? The order. Global security, global commerce, global capital, global scale, and an overpowering willingness to provide reliability so the world can build its entire world around a unified standard for size, weight, shape, and locks, enabling the ubiquitous container to move seamlessly through the supply chain. As early as 1966, the impact was obvious. Total port turnaround times on both ends shrank from 3 to 5 weeks to less than 24 hours. Port costs dipped from half the total cost of shipping to less than 1/5. By 2019, container ships carried approximately 50% of total global trade by value, up from functionally zero in the early 1960s. It isn't just ships and cargo methodology that have been redesigned. Ports have changed too. Ports have always required easy inland access, whether to access inputs or to distribute outputs. Before the Industrial Revolution, that typically meant a river. Think Hamburg, New Orleans, or Shanghai. At worst, ports required a big chunk of ocean-adjacent flat. Think St. Petersburg, Los Angeles, or Bangkok. In the modern day, however, containers' flexibility means all a port needs is road, and preferably rail, access. Instead of needing a rare and therefore expensive geographic alignment, ports can now be located outside cities, wherever the mix of land, labor, and electricity costs allow. Think Tianjin, Savannah, or St. John. But while lower costs, combined with the container's flexibility, enabled port siting to be less finicky, the ports themselves had to become more so. Now that anything and everything could be containerized and shipped, the ports had to be able to serve as way stations for absolutely colossal through volumes. And as ships became ever larger, not every port could play host. First to go were the medium-sized regional ports that simply couldn't handle the new transoceanic behemoths. Cargo either went to the newer, gargantuan mega-container ports, or to the very small ports that managed local distribution. As the megaports drew more and more cargo and became more and more mega, even small distribution hubs faded away. After all, rail lines could connect to the bigger ports and simply rail cargo to the small ports' own distribution network. Ports upriver, especially smaller ones that could not handle ocean-going vessels, became redundant. These kinds of economic rearrangements happened all over the world, setting off concurrent races to become the regional hub. Ports designed to serve a single metro region, think the ports of Paris, London, Brooklyn, St. Louis, or Chicago, all but evaporated. Instead, locations that could contort themselves into a shape that facilitated broad-scale container distribution, think the ports of Rotterdam, Felixstowe, New Jersey, Houston, or Tacoma, exploded into being. Larger and larger ships were sailing among fewer and fewer ports, which themselves became progressively larger and larger. Collectively, these first three implications have made maritime shipping king. Between 2000 and 2020, moving a container across the Atlantic or Pacific averaged out to about $700 per container, or put another way, 11 cents per pair of shoes. Even traditional choke points aren't very choky. One of the world's largest container ship classes in reasonably large-scale production, the Maersk Triple E class, pays about $1 million to transit the Suez Canal, but that duty gets split among 18,000-odd containers. That comes out to about $55 each, or less than a cent per shoe pair. Transport has become so rote that in 2019, the Chinese recycling industry had to place restrictions on the import of low-quality recycled trash. Combined with bigger, slower ships, containerization has reduced the total cost of transporting goods to less than 1% of said goods' overall cost. Before industrialization, that figure was typically more than 3/4. Pre-deep water, the figure was often north of 99%. Leaving aside the quiet little detail that you can't truck or rail cargo among London and Tokyo and Shanghai and Sydney and New York and Rio, even if the infrastructure were in place, cost comparisons would be utterly ridiculous. If you wanted a train that could compete in capacity with ships designed to just barely squeeze through the recently expanded Panama Canal, you'd need one more than 40 miles long. Alternatively, you could go for a fleet of 6,500 trucks. With transport costs now rounding to zero, the math of everything else has changed to match.